President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February 6, 2024 at about 7 p.m. in the building behind us, which is, of course, the Kremlin. The interview, as you will see if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine, how it started, what's happening, and most pressingly, how it might end. One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. There was no time limit on the interview. We ended it after more than 2 hours. Instead, what you're about to see seemed to us sincere, whether you agree with it or not. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia has a historic claim to parts of Western Ukraine. So our opinion would be to view it in that light, as a sincere
Okay, that's parts of Eastern Ukraine, of course. Welcome to my reaction to the interview that everyone is watching. We've got Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, but now his own man, we're told, and the president of the largest country in the world, Russia, Vladimir Putin, and they're meeting in Moscow. Now, it's certainly of great interest, I think, for the world, and I think it's also of importance that we hear the other side of the story, so to speak. And to me, it's also quite interesting because last year I had the chance to meet Tucker Carlson, and I had the chance to meet Vladimir Putin in Russia a few years ago, and I have been to Moscow. So let's see how this goes.
Of what he thinks. And with that, here it is. Mr. President, thank you. On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
We see that he's quite comfortable. Obviously, he's in his office where he's been for more than 20 years, taking his watch off, getting ready to give some proper answers.
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious tone.
So, of course, he set the tone here. He was going to not give just short sound bites, but actually present his case that he would like to be heard in the world, in the West. And, of course, he knows Tucker Carlson has more followers than most news stations or mainstream media programs put together. Tucker did not properly respond to the question, though, because for Vladimir Putin that was an important point in the beginning to set the stage. He did not want just a talk. He's going to have a serious conversation. I think it's Tucker who is in for a surprise in the first half hour.
Your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
It's slightly intriguing because, of course, at this stage, Putin must have been fully aware that his explanation is going to last more than 30 seconds or a minute. And, it was more than 20 minutes, almost half an hour. So I suppose he's also slightly ironic in his choice of words.
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from? The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood
создания российского государства.
And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862,
Новгород на северо-западе страны.
when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
Варягов. 862 год. В 1800
Now, we don't have to go through the whole history. The important point here is, and that's also where there's opposition, of course, from the Ukrainian side when they comment on this interview, they will be pointing their interpretation out here. When President Putin says that's the beginning of Russia in the 9th century, 800 and something, he is referring, he's correct, the beginning of Russia, and he's referring to the creation of the Rus, R-U-S, the Rus state, which was created by Scandinavians, the Vikings, essentially. The Vikings that settled there, Varangians is another name for them. And Rus, there's actually among historians a debate, where does this word come from? But in Russian you say Rasi, Ras, and of course it also has the meaning for blonde. And so you can see when these Scandinavians appeared, locals that may have originated further east, seeing them would refer mainly to the particularly obvious outside feature, while they're blonde. So Russia, the Rus, the Russians, the original Russians were actually Scandinavians. Now, these Scandinavians settled in many places, the Vikings. They also created, of course, kingdoms in Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, but particularly Russia, Rus, the original Russia was one creation. And then around the same time, in the 9th century and then onwards, they settled also in northern France. Normandy is named after them, the Northmen, the men from the north. And also, they took their Viking longboats into the Mediterranean. They also were quite sought after as mercenaries to fight. And they fought both in what is today Italy, but in those days was the Holy Roman Empire of German nation in the southern part. And they were partly at some stage fighting for the Pope, certainly being hired as mercenaries in the area, and later established themselves, and then actually at one stage drove out the Muslim rulers, the North African rulers that were in Sicily. And so Sicily became a Christian. Actually, that's basically, is one of the first crusades, but when the Pope said to the mercenaries, and a particular mercenary leader from Normandy, well, if you can drive them out, I'll make you ruler there. You become duke, and in fact, one of his close relatives became king of Sicily. So they succeeded in that. And that may have led also to the Norman invasion of England, because when back in Normandy, William, Duke of Normandy, at that stage heard that, wow, this guy from the Hauteville family, they were French speaking by that time, because when the Normans settled down, they were men, and so they married locally, and it's called mother tongue for a reason. So already by the second generation, the Norse language was gone, they were French speaking. And so when William of Normandy, the Duke, heard about this, wow, that guy from this family, not even such a high-ranking family, is now Duke of Sicily and on track to, they could become kings of Sicily for the Pope. He also reached out to the Pope, and the Pope said, yeah, there's something you can do for me too. There's another island not too far away. I'm always struggling with these Saxon kings in England. They always want to appoint the bishops and don't let me appoint bishops, and so that's another story, okay? like Vladimir Putin. I could also tell you a bit about history, and so William the Conqueror conquered, of course, England, which was another crusade. So the first crusades were actually in the west. Later they turned east when the popes realized, oh, this works quite well. We can motivate these people by anointing them kings. So these were the Vikings from Scandinavia, and they were also very active and successful in the area, coming in from Scandinavia and then going down the various rivers, the Volga and so on, further south. They established a kingdom there. They were also sought after as mercenaries in Byzantium, East Rome, Constantinople, and there they're known as Varangians. All right, so enough history. But one important point actually is that, you see, so the Russian origin is actually Scandinavians, and that therefore is a common origin for both what later became Ukrainians and Russians. Now, this doesn't come out so clearly in President Putin's explanation, and therefore is slightly open to some criticism by Ukrainians who will argue, or pro-Ukrainian commentaries, who will argue, oh, he's slightly, he's sort of taking Ukrainian history and making it Russian. Actually, it is a joint history. Ukraine, as he will explain, is a modern invention that was created essentially actively only in the 20th century under the Bolsheviks, but we'll come to that.
1962, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood, dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince...
You can see how Tucker is pretty puzzled. 1,000-year history is quite mind-blowing when you've come from America. History is much shorter there.
Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's younger son,
По сути, функция регента
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
к этому времени пришел в Киев, отстранил от власти.
So the other point is that, of course, the capital of this joint origin of Russians and then what later would be called, Ukrainians versus Russians. So this joint origin, this original Russian Rus kingdom, had one capital, that was Kiev, and then you could argue there was Novgorod, which was also another very large Viking settlement. And actually that's the older one. Novgorod came first, and then Kiev is further south, became the capital of Rus. And so the original Russians were there. And so Kiev obviously, is quite special to Russians, to modern day Russians. Of course, it's, as you know, since the 20th century, become a separate unit and increasingly separated, particularly after the Cold War ended and the communism, the Soviet Union fell. But to Russians, it is quite special. And that's, I think, also why President Putin felt it's important for people to realize this. It's not just some place, some country, some people. To Russians, it is really their origin. That's where they're from.
He ousted two brothers who apparently had
Членами дружины Рюрика.
once been members of Rurik's squad.
Имея два центра в Киеве и в Новгороде.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
Следующая очень значимая дата в истории
The
России.
next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Владимир
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизован.
And of course, the Vikings did that also in the West, in Normandy, around a similar time. The Vikings also became Christian, and then the mercenary Normans, moving from Normandy when you're a younger son and you didn't inherit because it was Salic law, only the eldest and on the male line would inherit. The others would move to places where they could earn something. And of course, what they were very good at was fighting, and so a lot of them became mercenaries. Particularly one family, the Hauteville family, they became leaders in what later became Italy, southern Italy, working for the Pope and then gaining territories, being given territories, and ultimately became, kings of Sicily. So of course by that time they were Christian as well. And of course, when William the Conqueror conquered England, it was a crusade for the Pope, and of course the Normans are famous for building these fantastic huge churches, these churches and cathedrals. And of course that was the most expensive thing you could do, was building a huge cathedral, which required financing, which is where the Norman financing system comes in, which was very, very clever. Anyway, but the same people, they were also in Rus, and they are the original Russians.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties, one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape. Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne. But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons.
It's already complicated for Tucker, I'm afraid, I think.
Was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines. All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state. There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe.
He is referring to what happened in continental Europe when Karl the Great, of course, for the formal written language they would use, for documents they would use Latin. So Carolus the Great, in English known after the French pronunciation Charlemagne, Karl the Great, Carolus Magnus. He was the ruler of the Franks, and the Franks had conquered these western parts, which then were named after them, France. But actually they're a Germanic tribe, a German tribe, the Franks. They later crossed the Rhine and they crossed the Main. Where they crossed the Main, that's the ford. When you cross the river, it's a ford, and it's the ford where the Franks crossed the river Main is known as Frankfurt. In German, it's Furt. And of course, the Franks were German-speaking. Karl the Great, Charlemagne, was German-speaking, but his sons then divided up the empire, and that's why then later France became separate, and also the language then, the majority were still speaking a Latin-derived language. That's how French came about. And then we had two other sons that essentially created German-speaking parts. And so he's referring to that. So in that sense, what happened in Russia was the same that happened in the rest of Europe.
Русское государство стало легкой добычей.
But the fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan.
Yeah, we're touching now on the most painful part of Russian history. In fact, we could say Slavic history, and that is the invasions from the east, from the Far East. Actually, much earlier already, it was the Huns, the Hunnic invasions, and they're essentially also Mongols, but in that era, in the 5th century, they would be called Huns. That's where, the the original Asian settlers of Hungary come from, the HUN in Hungary, the Huns. Of course, later, settlers also came and hordes on their horseback, crossed the wide steppe of Central Asia and came over and also settled the Magyar. But in Russia, the most traumatic period was under the so-called Golden Horde. It was the next generation after Genghis Khan, and they subjugated big parts of Russia and Slavic lands, and of course that's a period of subjugation. It's also therefore a period of racial mixing, if you want, because of course the Mongols would take the women they'd like. And so, of course, this is also when the population will start to be very much affected by this. And, this lasted for a few centuries, and is quite a traumatic period. Now, that's where the ones that are the sort of, Russians that are further west would then claim to be, more European. And that's where later outsiders saw an opportunity to cause division among them and saying, oh, we're the pure ones, or we're the real ones, and not you. But it is quite unnatural, because basically, the fact is in Europe, continental Europe, the same for Germany, there's very few natural borders, unlike Britain or, islands, Sicily. There's a bigger obstacle, but in continental Europe, without natural borders, there are the rivers, some are harder to cross, but ultimately the hordes swept through, often from the east to the west, sometimes the other way around, and therefore there's so much mixing that, continental Europeans are quite mixed, that's a fact. And so you find that this narrative is a bit of a political narrative that's designed to cause division among people, and particularly among essentially the Russian speakers, and that happened to the Russians, and then Ukrainians were split out. The argument was made, oh, you are different, you're not Russians, you're Ukrainians, and you're different, perhaps you're better than Russians. You see, this was put into there. Some outsiders were whispering into the ears of some leading Western Russians that then wanted to call themselves Ukrainians and so on. So you have to see how these things are being manipulated.
Successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty. They had...
There's different interpretations of this. So did the northern cities preserve sovereignty? Well, if you were very north, you wouldn't be affected. The horde didn't go that much north. But Moscow, for example, essentially accepted the rule of the Mongols. And if you did that, you had to pay tribute, but they would let you live. Now, if you refused that, then they would wipe you out and destroy you. So this could be an argument for saying that, oh, that's why the Russians in Moscow and these places that basically said, okay, we have no choice, we give in, we become subject to the Khan and his horde. They survived, and the ones that refused, maybe further west and south, where today Ukraine is, they were wiped out. So what does this mean? It's hard to be sure whether, therefore, who's the purer. So, and I think I'm quite skeptical of this entire discussion of who's purer in terms of still being more Scandinavian, perhaps, because basically continental Europeans are very, very mixed, and this narrative is usually just used to cause unnecessary division. And you could have a story either way. Maybe the Russians are more pure, maybe the Western groups like Belarus means white Russia for that reason, could be more But maybe it's the other way around, because they were actually destroyed some parts by the Mongols and wiped out and subjugated and enslaved, and their women taken. Who's to say which one is more pure? So we have to be very cautious about any such discussions. But these discussions have happened in the 20th century. We'll come to that. And they've been utilized for political purposes. And that's also where, you see, when you talk about racial stuff, you can see how it's a fine line if you continue that. And that opened the door for this whole Nazi ideology, which seems to be quite strong in Ukraine. You see, this is how it's connected, but we'll come to that.
Pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty.
Складываться единое российское государство.
And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow.
Оно начало
The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev,
тому центру, который
began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe.
And so you heard, Kiev saying this, is one of the capital cities of the Russian state, and that's how, for Russians, it is. They would always say, well, Ukrainians are Russians. They're us. They're our original, the Rus are the original Russians. But of course, by being physically, geographically further to the west, being closer to the rest of Europe, Putin is pointing out here, of course, they were also then more influenced and got entangled with European events. Whereas if you're further east, like Moscow is quite a long way, there was less happening in terms of Europeans coming around.
Его даже называли
This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
составляли значительную
It was even called the Lithuanian Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population.
главными.
They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox.
Объединение, уния Великое княжество Литовское.
But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland.
Of course, you also have to know that the languages spoken in all these lands are very similar. People talk about the Slavic languages. Particularly, obviously, Russian and Ukrainian are very, very similar. But then also other Slavic languages in these lands, Lithuania is mentioned, and even Poland. Of course, Polish doesn't use the Cyrillic writing, but uses Latin writing, the Latin alphabet, and therefore looks different and more Western, if you want. And of course, it's also the religious, the branch of the church, being, more directly linked to Rome, Catholic, facilitated that, therefore using Latin writing. Whereas the Eastern Church started with Byzantium, East Rome. But of course, as you know, East Rome was actually the continuation of the original Rome. When Rome fell, the Roman Empire continued only in the East. And the West was overrun by the Germans, Germanic states, the Goths and the Lombards and all the Germanic states settling in Italy, particularly northern Italy. And in the East, the Roman Empire continued and had become, Christian, of course, from the 4th century majority onwards. Constantinople, Emperor Constantine. And therefore, you could argue that's the real European, the tradition, the Christian tradition is in the East. And of course, the Orthodox Church has very old traditions and rituals and so on. And so, there's always two sides to the coin, and you can never say which one is the real one. Certainly from an Eastern European perspective, the Orthodox Church clearly has a very long pedigree and goes back to the ancient original Christians that today are still in the Levant, in what we call the Middle East, in Syria. Christian churches, the Christian population used to be a third of Syria, which is why, Russia has been giving military help and has been invited by the Syrian leader to help, and Russia has been very keen to help because there's the Orthodox Church is very strong in Syria, and then of course also further south, even Palestine, there's Christian churches and Israel and so on. Okay, let's continue.
A few years later, another union was signed, but this time already in the religious sphere. Some of the Orthodox priests became subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state. During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population. They introduced their language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians. Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that the person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service.
That's an important point. And of course, words, have the etymology, gives you historical context and insights. And so what does Ukrainian mean? He's just said it. It's somebody living on the fringes, and that was used by the Polish sort of leadership, if you want, as they describe their, kingdom and little, empire, if you want. And these would be the Russians, who'd speak, a language that's similar, Slavic to Polish, but a bit different, and would be quite far away on their borders. And so they were given by the Polish, from the Polish side, the name Ukrainian. That's where it comes from. Just like, the original Rus, the Ras, the blonde ones, were called that by the locals when the Scandinavians arrived, But it tells you that actually, it confirms this idea that the Ukrainians and the Russians are the same people. This is just what the Polish people would call these Russians that they were dealing with. And of course, for Russians, the name Russian stuck.
Didn't mean any particular ethnic group. So the Poles were trying to, in every possible way, to colonize this part of the Russian lands, and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights. They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell?
And so again, that he's pointing out how, when you have a state that has different ethnic groups and languages that are, perhaps a bit more different, so between Polish and Russian, so the Russian speakers didn't want to be suppressed, and they didn't really like the Polonization, the Polish language being emphasized, and so they wrote these letters, please also respect our traditions, our language, and so on. And of course, then there's the religious difference as well, because Polish were Catholic, linked to the Pope, whereas the Russians and the Russians that were called Ukrainians by the Polish were Eastern Orthodox.
What period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century.
В 13 веке. Это было в 13 веке. Значит, и...
Now I will tell you what happened later,
Дальше я назову даты, чтобы не было путаницы.
and give the dates so that there is no confusion.
В 1600...
And in 1654, even a bit earlier,
Чуть раньше даже, люди, которые контролировали
the
власть,
people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands
чтобы присылали к ним направление.
addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
Чтобы вы не думали, что
So these Ukrainians, i.e. Russians that were subject to Polish leadership being the rulers, they at one stage turned further east to Moscow and the leaders in Moscow for support. And so he's pointing out that this happened in the 17th century.
Придумал. Дима.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these
Я вам отдам
documents.
вот эти документы.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years
Не-не-не.
ago.
Не.
So yes, it's clearly quite important to President Putin to make that clear that this is the Russian perception, and it seems quite a truthful description. And I'm sure these documents, I mean, that's it's quite interesting. It would be interesting to see them. Turns out they're in Russian, so Tucker is not going to be able to use them directly, but I'm sure they will show that this is what happened.
Такие.
But still,
Документы из архива.
these are documents from the archives, copies.
Здесь письма Богдана
Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky,
контролировал власть в этой
the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian lands
в Варшаву.
that is now called Ukraine.
А после того, как
He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld.
с просьбой взять их,
And after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. They are
And so that's of course of legal relevance, and to the extent that it has been used time and again by invaders. Invaders will always claim, oh, the local population is calling us. So then you have to examine, and that's why I think he's giving these documents, because he's saying it's not just the usual, okay, there's some Muscovite 17th century invaders taking these lands. It is actually a truthful situation because they were Russian speaking, because they felt a bit sort of oppressed by the Polonization, the Polish language being pressed on them and whatever, and their rights not being taken care of. They turned to Moscow. The Tsar already in place there, the ruler, would look after them better, they felt. And so this is something the world should look at. We should look at these documents. It's certainly quite a convincing case, I would say. But anyway, we're still only in the 17th century. Of course, the 17th century is a special century where a lot of things happened also in the western parts of Europe, in the Netherlands and also in England. The financial revolutions took place. The monetary system became more or less what it is today. That's really a creation of the 17th century. And that also means the role of banks and bankers became quite important. So that could be relevant, but it's certainly something we should keep in mind, because of course when you do some historical analysis, one tends to focus on the ruler. He's the king, he's got the power, he's got an army. That's true, but you see, even a king needs to pay the army, and weapons are expensive. Investments in infrastructure and military equipment, but also the transportation infrastructure, bridges and so on is very expensive. So you need money, and whoever gives the money, if there's loans, that makes the lender quite powerful. As you know, Proverb 22:7, the borrower is servant to the lender. So that's something that became quite prominent in the 17th century, and warfare, you have to remember, is very much connected to those who financed the war. In fact, actually, they were often called war factors, because factor, the word factor, was a description of some kind of businessman of the day who's running a company that would engage in business transactions, financial transactions. And There were so-called court factors doing the financial dealings for the rulers, the princes, the kings, and often because they were focusing on war finance, they were even called war factor, which may be more apt than they thought at the time. But anyway, keep it in mind.
Copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later. Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the Pan-Russian Assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar, which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654...
So that's another fact, that essentially there was quite a long-lasting rivalry between Poland and Russia. And it sort of, came to the forefront in the 17th century, but that continued for quite a while, and you could even argue until today. And that has been used by outside forces to, outside forces that are against Russia. They could use this by then, always sort of trying to get the Poles on their side and pointing out where something is good for Poland. Then you'd have an ally against Russia. Anyway.
A truce was concluded. And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed. And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland. Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west. This all lasted until the revolution. Before World War I, Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization.
That's an interesting point. So now we are now in the 20th century. And so President Putin is pointing out that this idea of emphasizing that Ukrainians are different from Russians started with the Austrian military, the Austrian General Staff. And of course, you have to remember this was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was quite a large one. It included a lot of today's Eastern European countries. They were part of this, not just Hungary, but what today is, Slovakia, Czech Republic, parts of Ukraine as well, and so on. So you had, and of course the some Balkan states, Croatia, Slovenia, and so on. So you had quite a large, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and of course to lay claim to lands there, then you would have an incentive to tell people, no, you're not Russian, you're different, you're separate. Otherwise, they would feel like we want to belong to Russia. And so that seems to be the source, the second period of this Ukrainian, nationality being emphasized. So first it was by Poland, and then by Austro-Hungarian military.
Their motive was obvious. Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area. So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared. All those, however, claimed that Ukraine should have a very good relationship with Russia.
Вот.
They insisted on that.
После революции 1917 года
After the 1917 revolution,
старались восстановить государственность. Развернулась
the
гражданская.
Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood, and the civil war began, including the hostilities with Poland.
В Польше в 1921 году, по которым западная
In
часть
1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland.
в 1939
In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler,
сотрудничала с Гитлером, а Польша сотрудничала.
it did collaborate with Hitler, you know? Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship,
В архивах есть. Предлагал с Польшей
an alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg.
основную часть Германии с
Here one has to be aware that after the First World War, the Versailles Treaty created very strange borders. Essentially, they were created in order to be able to cause mischief in the future because millions of people were clearly on the wrong side of the border. A quarter of the German territory of imperial pre-First World War Germany was taken away and was given to other countries, and a whole bunch of other countries were newly created because essentially the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was taken apart, disassembled, and many countries were created, and also Imperial Germany was, one quarter taken away and the lands given to other countries. Of course, who was doing this? Who was active? Well, it can only be the powers that were not defeated. Now, of course, the First World War famously ended on the 11th of November 1918 as a truce. It was a truce. A truce means all armies say, let's stop. Let's just stop. So why do we then speak of defeated countries and victors? Well, because although the German army, Germans tend to sort of stick to agreements and in many ways a bit naive when it comes to international diplomacy, they thought, okay, well, we'll disband the army and that's it. Because we've ended the war, we have a truce. Well, of course, this is not what the other countries did. France then actually started to occupy German territories, French troops, and also the British army did the opposite of disbanding. They continued to fight. This is why when you, in England, go to the small villages and you look at the cenotaph, this is the memorial pillar for the many, many dead who died, the soldiers who died in the First World War. And in many villages in England, it will not give you what most people consider the dates of the First World War, 1914 to 1918. No, in many villages, it says 1914 to 1919. So for a whole year, there were still records coming in, reports coming in to the local parish priest of dead, people, boys, young kids usually, from that village who died abroad in warfare, also in 1919. So of course they would write it on that memorial cenotaph because the relatives, the parents are there and they're mourning. So you can't say, oh, it ended 1918 and what, we have all these dead bodies coming in? So where were these dead bodies coming in from? You see, because the British army was still fighting. Vis-a-vis Germany, the Navy was creating a huge naval blockade so that after the war had ended, so late 1918, throughout the year 1919, Germany was subjected to a complete boycott, naval blockade, and so that shipping of food into Germany was not possible. As a result, there was a huge famine, and I mean, estimates vary, but it seems to be more than 1 million people starved to death in 1919 because of the British blockade of Germany. It was a terrible time. So that's what the Navy did. But British soldiers were also continuing to fight. Where? Well, one is in Palestine, okay? And the other place is in Russia. What were British troops doing in Russia? President Putin, I don't think is going to touch on that, but he does mention the Bolshevik Revolution. What was that about? Well, you see, around that time, starting in 1917, the Imperial Russian leadership, the Tsar family, the Tsar was overthrown and the family was brutally murdered, children and so on. And this revolutionary bunch took over. Well, the leaders of that, there was Lenin, there was Trotsky. They weren't even in the country when this happened. They were shipped in from abroad. One came from New York, the other one was in Switzerland, and before I think in Vienna, even Munich. It's all very strange, you see. And they had money from the outside, it seems. And of course, British troops were fighting in 1919 in Russia still. Well, they were not fighting to re-establish the imperial family, despite the fact that the last Russian Tsar was a cousin of the English king, and they looked almost identical. If you looked at them, look at pictures, Is it George and the Tsar, was it Nicholas? We have to check. Anyway, so the British troops were essentially supporting the Bolsheviks. Now, President Putin does not mention the British in all of this, but I think, that's where we have to be aware of a bit more context.
С Кёнигсбергом и с Восточной Пруссией.
After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Dansk emerged.
So I mentioned earlier, so Germany lost 1/4 of its territory after the First World War, and they even took away bits in between in Germany, so that some parts of Germany were now not connected to the rest. I mean, quite extraordinary. These are the crazy borders that were drawn post-war in Versailles. And, I asked earlier, so who was drawing these borders? Well, it was a nation that was doing well out of the First World War. Let's say the leadership and the financial, sector did very well out of this. And it wasn't Germany deciding this. So who was it? Well, it was Britain largely, and British influence, of course, was very strong. Also US influence, and US and Britain together dominated the Versailles Treaty. Of course, often they would hide behind other groups because there was many people arguing and sometimes support this and that in order to achieve your strategic goals. And so they created these borders, and the principle was that there would be millions of people on the wrong side of the border, and there would be these artificial countries created, one of them being Ukraine. Another artificial country was Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was essentially created by the British. The leadership was in British exile during the Second World War, and then was put into place after 1945, and they created this state. Britain in preparation created a university, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University of London. That's where you can train your agents. And so they were prepared for the breakup, very well prepared for the breakup of Imperial Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. And they could take maximum advantage of creating all these states. Czechoslovakia is a strange state, and it's a good example because the name suggests two ethnic groups, the Czechs and the Slovaks. But there were more ethnic groups than that. There were some Hungarians, there were ethnic, some other ethnic minorities. We don't have to mention all of them, but let's just mention the three largest groups. So number one was the Czech ethnic people. They're the largest. So fair enough, they're named first, Czech. Now, Czechoslovakia, next comes Slovakia. Well, actually, the Slovaks were the third largest group. What happened with the second largest ethnic group? Who were they? Well, they were the Germans. There were around 5 million Germans there. In German territory, that had always been German or, of course, slash Austrian, because it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but partly ethnically they were Saxons and Franks that had been living there forever, because, of course, the ethnic Czechs came from the east. And the Slovaks speaking a Slavic language. But this land was taken, they were made part of the state of Czechoslovakia instead of, because they were on the border to Germany. So you could just say, okay, that's part of Germany, but no, they were made part of Czechoslovakia despite now being the second largest group, ethnic group in the state. They were not mentioned in the name. It was only called Czechoslovakia, not Czecho-German Slovakia or something, And you can see the point, because that's how you create ethnic strife. And what happened predictably was the German language was suppressed, the Germans were treated badly, and you get, unrest, and you can create basically you can set the time bomb for some future excuse for a war, which almost happened surrounding Czechoslovakia, but then the Munich Treaty in 1938 settled things when Britain and France agreed to give these parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany. And of course, it was a similar situation with Ukraine, because there were millions of Russians that would not even call themselves Ukrainians because their language was 100% the same as Russians. The Crimea, of course, also area, and Donbass. And then even the remainder speaking a dialect of Russian that was then called Ukrainian. Historically they also were called or considered Russians by many. But then of course you had others, you had Polish speakers in Ukraine, and you still have parts, because of course, President Putin will come to that. After the Second World War, Stalin then gave a big chunk of Poland to Ukraine, and then he took a big chunk of Germany and made it part of Poland. So we had these huge shifts in borders, which created a lot of strife and tragedies and disastrous stories. I mean, for many people, there were 16 million Germans that were, after the Second World War, essentially driven out. In Czechoslovakia in 1946, the 5 million Germans, well, by that time it was fewer because the men were gone. Many died in the war or were prisoners of war. And they were then ethnically cleansed by the Czechs in 1946. So at least 4 million Germans were ethnically cleansed. Of course, this is not a nice process. We can witness it at the moment in other parts of the world. A lot of people die in this process, and that's also what happened in 1946 with Czechoslovakia. And, these are the things that also happened to Ukraine. It's a very similar story. So, it is quite for Eastern Europeans, there's a lot of tragedy and pain looking at this and reflecting back on this, which is why it's important to have diplomacy and try to solve these things amicably, which, as President Putin will point out, he tried to do before he got into action, but he was rebuffed and refused again and again by the West, particularly the US.
И вместо Данцига появился.
Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they...
Okay, so here he's talking about, in fact, Czechoslovakia. So Hitler had a deal with Poland before the beginning of the Second World War, that some areas of Czechoslovakia, which Britain had created after the First World War, will be given to Poland. And in exchange, he wanted to have a bit of territory that's German, with German speakers living in Poland, and basically have a connection to the eastern part of Germany. There was no connection anymore. East Prussia, with the capital city of Königsberg, which later the Russians today call Kaliningrad, still Russian occupied, but and that's again where the British, who remain unnamed in this interview, intervened. They strongly, well, actually, no, they will be named when Boris Johnson suddenly appears, but there is a precedence to this. So the British suddenly appeared talking to the Poles when they were about to make a deal with Hitler. And the British said, no, you shouldn't make a deal with Hitler. You can do better. And don't worry, don't compromise, don't worry, we'll back you up. We're right there, standing right behind you with the entire military might of the global British Empire. We're right behind you. Which was a lie, because this is not what happened. Of course, Poland then, with the beginning of the Second World War, was divided up between the Soviet Union and Germany. And the British didn't do anything about that, did they? Actually, they did declare war on Germany only, but not on the Soviet Union. They made the Soviet Union an ally. When both actually had occupied Poland, and the Soviet Union even got the bigger part of Poland. You see how this works.
Of course. Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
Sure.
I'll tell you. I'm coming to that. This briefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but it explains many
I
things.
just don't know how it's relevant.
Good. Good. I'm so gratified that you appreciate that. Thank you. So, before...
So it's a bit of a dig, and yeah, Tucker gets it. He's smiling here now.
World War II, Poland collaborated with Hitler, and although it did not yield to Hitler's demands, it still participated in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia together with Hitler, as the Poles had not given the Danzig corridor to Germany and went too far, pushing Hitler to start World War II by attacking them. What?
Of course, I would disagree with the phrasing here. So what happened was these negotiations between Germany and Poland essentially did not succeed, and the Polish became completely recalcitrant and did not want to have an agreement. So then Hitler stepped up, pressure and warnings. Also the German population of Poland, there was a lot of discrimination, lots of incidents where they were attacked and so on. So he felt he had to intervene. Now, Poland is likely to have agreed to some kind of compromise, a peaceful settlement, which was the aim also of Hitler, surprise, surprise. But the British had told the Polish leadership, don't worry, don't compromise, just be tough. We'll prevent any problem. We'll be there. If the Germans want to invade, we'll be there. Well, they weren't. So when the German army then moved into the former German territory that was at that time under, post-Versailles Treaty, under Polish administration, the British declared war on Germany, and that's how the Second World War started. So it's a matter of record that the Second World War started when Britain declared war on Germany. And how did the First World War start? Oh, Britain declared war on Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire, its ally, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay.
Did Poland, against whom the war started on 1st September 1939? Poland turned out to be uncompromising, and Hitler had nothing to do but start implementing his plans with Poland. By the way, the USSR, I have read some archived documents, behaved very honestly. It asked Poland's permission to transit its troops through the Polish territory to help Czechoslovakia.
Советский Союз.
But the then Polish foreign minister said that if the Soviet planes flew over Poland, they would be downed over the territory of Poland.
Война началась.
But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the war began, and Poland fell prey to the policies it had pursued against Czechoslovakia, as under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Part of the territory, including Western Ukraine, was to be given to Russia. Thus, Russia, which was then named the USSR, regained its historical lands. After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II,
Эти территории окончательно были
all those territories were ultimately enshrined as belonging to Russia,
Польша.
to the USSR.
При этой компенсации, так надо полагать.
The important point here is that when Ukraine became a separate state, it was something that Russia actually initiated. And we should not forget that. So it's not as if Ukraine fought some kind of war of independence against Russia and became independent. No, it was Russia deciding, okay, you can be a separate state. Let's be friends, but you can be a separate state. That's how it actually happened.
For Poland, it received, apparently in compensation, the lands which had originally been German.
Западную, восточную часть.
This is about the German territory, even more German territory after the Second World War now being given to Poland, because Stalin took the eastern part of Poland and made it a part of Ukraine and said, okay, you take from Germany. And so as the Soviet troops were right in Berlin, of course he could arrange for that. He just gave this German territory to Poland, where it still is today. And also Russian troops are still in East Prussia today, because that, the Russians kept for themselves and has remained a part of, it's one of the federal republics of Russia.
Eastern parts of Germany, these are now western lands of Poland.
Ну, естественно, и опять вернули.
Of course, Poland regained access to the Baltic Sea and Danzig,
Данциг, который опять стал называться.
which was once again given its Polish name.
Of course, Danzig was always a German city. There was no doubt about that. And so I think he mentions that because several times he mentions Danzig, because it was a great northern Baltic Sea German city, and it's Polish now, and I think it's sort of to hint at how the Poles like to take other people's territory. I think it's sort of the dig here.
Вот таким образом сложилось.
So this was how this situation developed.
Формирование Советского Союза, это уже 1900.
In 1922, when the USSR was being established,
Большевики начали формировать
the
СССР.
Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before.
Right.
Который до сих пор вообще не существовал.
So the Bolsheviks created the Soviet Ukraine. Of course, the Bolsheviks were running the Soviet Union, and when Putin says for unknown reasons, to me that's code for there are reasons that he's not going to mention, but it's something to look into for us. Okay, and he specifically talks about Bolsheviks, not Russians.
Stalin insisted that those republics be included in the USSR as
Входили в качестве автономных
autonomous entities.
Основатель советского государства Ленин стоял.
For some inexplicable reason, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they be entitled to withdraw from the USSR.
That's an interesting point, that these Soviet republics that were sort of top down by the Russian leadership, the Bolshevik leadership ruling Russia and the Soviet Union, top down they decided we're going to have these separate Soviet republics like Ukraine, and they can be broken out. And he says this is inexplicable for some inexplicable reason. The Bolsheviks decided that if they want, they can then also break this out. And so, of course, I mean, I think he's referring to groups within the Soviet Union that were very strong among the Bolsheviks, that particularly had an interest in Ukraine for historical reasons.
And again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine, and yet they were made part of that Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Those lands.
So that's a very important point. You know, they'd never been called Ukraine, and it was the Soviet leadership making them part of a separate republic that was created and that could be broken out. So it wasn't the locals demanding it. It was a top-down decision, and it came from, well, Russia is the successor of the Soviet Union. It came from the leadership there.
Included the Black Sea region, which was received under Catherine the Great, and which had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever. Even if we go as far back as 1654, when these lands returned to Russian Empire, that territory was the size of 3 to 4 regions of modern Ukraine, with no Black Sea region. That was completely out of the question.
In 1654.
Exactly.
You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of this region, but why didn't you make this case for the first 22 years as president that Ukraine wasn't a real country?
Да. Итак, значит, советская Украина получила.
The Soviet Union was given a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region.
Когда Россия их получила в результате.
At some point, when Russia received them as an outcome of the Russo-Turkish Wars, they were called New Russia or Novorossiya. But that does not matter. What matters is that Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, established Ukraine that way. For decades, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic developed as part of the USSR. And for unknown reasons, again, the Bolsheviks were engaged in Ukrainianization.
That's another hint here. For unknown reasons, the Bolsheviks were engaged in Ukrainianization. So they were pushing this ideology that Ukrainians are different and they're not Russian, which of course laid the groundwork for, in the 1930s and 40s, the Nazi movement to somehow be seeded and spread in Ukraine. We have to ask, where do these movements come from? The National Socialist movement in Germany, the fascist movement in Italy, the fascist movement in Spain, and they all have sort of a similar system. You know, it's important to have a great uniform designer, you need a great speechwriter, you need some, proper director to have proper media modern type, effects when speeches and events, are staged. And it was the same pattern in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, and also Ukraine, you see. So who could be doing this? I mean, who was not really devastated after the First World War, and therefore had, and perhaps had some strategic goals on how to meddle and mess with Europe. In the case of Mussolini, it's now a matter of public record that Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, in fact, that was the first successful fascist movement in power before the Nazis in Germany, already from 1922 onwards, 22, 23, he was in power. Hitler staged his first putsch in 22. So it's a matter of public record that Mussolini was a British agent. Literally, look it up. MI5. He was an MI5 paid agent. So you can go and figure.
was not merely because the Soviet leadership was composed to a great extent of those originating from Ukraine. Rather, it was explained by the general policy of indigenization pursued by the Soviet Union. Same things were done in other Soviet republics. This involved promoting national languages and national cultures, which is not a bad in principle. That is how the Soviet Ukraine was created. After the World War II, Ukraine received, in addition to the lands that had belonged to Poland before the war, part of the lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania. So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine. And they...
Yes, in fact, Hungary is one of the countries and nations that lost a lot of territory, both after the First World War and also again after the Second World War, as he's just describing. After the First World War, Hungary lost a lot of territory. It was very large beforehand, and historically, the Hungarian people have been, in a very large area, which means today there's ethnic Hungarians that still speak and write Hungarian only, but they live in Slovakia. Substantial areas. There's many that live in Romania because big chunks were given to Romania when that state was created in this form. And likewise, there's, as you will mention, Hungarians in Ukraine, there's Hungarians in Serbia, there's Hungarians in quite a lot of places. And it just shows you that the borders, the drawing of these borders has been somewhat strange and not really in such a way that it would maximize peace and harmony.
Still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe...
And of course, that's true for some of these other artificial states, like Czechoslovakia. It was an artificial state that was created essentially by the British after the First World War, and it was so artificial that it caused a lot of tragedies and devastation, ethnic cleansing, and in the end, very recently in the 1990s, the peoples there decided, let's break it up, and there was a peaceful separation of the Czechs and the Slovaks into two separate states. That's how artificial it was.
Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
I'm not sure whether they should go back to the 1654 borders. But given Stalin's time, so-called Stalin's regime, which, as many claim, saw numerous violations of human rights and violations of the rights of other states,
В этом смысле, конечно, вполне можно, если не говорить о том, что они имеют на это право.
One may say that they could claim back those lands of theirs while having no right to do that. It is at least understandable.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine?
Никогда не говорил.
Never. I have never told him, not a single time.
У нас с ним даже на этот счет не было никаких разговоров. Но мне достоверно...
We have not even had any conversation on that, but I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there
Они, конечно, хотят вернуться на свою историю.
wanted to get back to their historical land.
Интересную историю, отвлекусь.
Moreover, I would like to share a very interesting story with you. I digress, it's a personal one. Somewhere in the early 80s, I went on a road trip in a car from then Leningrad across the Soviet Union through Kiev. Made a stop in Kiev and then went to western Ukraine. I went to the town of Beregovoye, and all the names of towns and villages there were in Russian and in a language I did not understand, in Hungarian, in Russian and in Hungarian, not in Ukrainian, in Russian and in Hungarian. I was driving through some kind of village and there were men sitting next to the houses and they were wearing black three-piece suits and black cylinder hats. I asked, are they some kind of entertainers? I was told, no, they were not entertainers, they're Hungarians. I said, what are they doing here? What do you mean? This is their land, they live here. This was during the Soviet time in the 1980s. They preserved the Hungarian language, Hungarian names, and all their national costumes. They are Hungarians and they feel themselves to be Hungarians. And of course, when now there is an infringement.
Well, that is, and there's a lot.
So these Hungarians are now part of Ukraine. In fact, they have to send, their sons to the war. Lots of Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine have died, even at the hands of Russian forces, because they were sent there by the Ukrainian government. It's a very sad story. And of course, as President Putin has been saying, even before he started this military action, he wanted to settle it peacefully, and he'll be saying that again, I'm sure.
Though I think many nations are upset about Transylvania as well, as you obviously know. But many nations feel frustrated by the redrawn borders of the wars of the 20th century.
Definitely.
And wars going back 1,000 years, the ones that you mentioned. But the fact is that you didn't make this case in public until 2 years ago, February. And in the case that you made, which I read today, you explain at great length that you felt a physical threat from the West in NATO, including potentially a nuclear threat. And that's what got you to move. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
Of course, the case has been made. So, Tucker shouldn't really claim, oh, you've never said this. I think what President Putin has been saying so far, probably every single Russian knows, because it has been said many times. And, clearly Tucker Carlson doesn't follow all the speeches by President Putin in Russian in Russia, particularly since, of course, even Russian news services that go to the trouble of translating everything into English and having English services, English language services or German language services, have been forbidden, surprisingly, in Germany and in Britain and in other countries, European countries, because we're not supposed to hear that information. So that makes some journalists feel like, oh, you haven't made your case. Well, if even the news organizations are banned, maybe you don't want to hear the case. Maybe that's the story.
I understand that my long speeches probably fall outside of the genre of the interview. That is why I asked you at the beginning, are we going to have a serious talk or a show? You said a serious talk. So bear with me, please. We're coming to the point where the Soviet Ukraine was established. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And everything that Russia had generously bestowed on Ukraine was dragged away by the latter. I'm coming to a very important point of today's agenda.
So, when the Soviet Ukraine was created, a lot of Russian lands were included in it by generous design or whatever, by the leadership of the Soviet Union. And then in 91, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine left and took the Russian lands with it. Now the Russians have been patient about this because they feel, well, the whole of, most of the Ukrainians, maybe not the Polish-speaking parts, but the rest, they're like us. And therefore they didn't mind. But of course, when, and this is now coming up, then outsiders start to meddle again and make Ukraine very anti-Russian, and they want Western military and troops stationed there, and they want to be part of NATO, then that is a step too far, as the Russian leadership has said for many, many years, that would be a red line. And they've been very, very clear about that for a long, long time.
Thank you.
After all, the collapse of the Soviet Union was effectively initiated by the Russian leadership. I do not understand what the Russian leadership was guided by at the time. But I suspect there were several reasons to think everything would be fine.
Первое. Ну, во-первых, я думаю, что руководство России исходило из того, что
First,
фундаментальные
I think that then Russian leadership believed that the fundamental, all of these were so fundamental. All these elements together make our good relationships inevitable.
Я хочу, чтобы вы, как американские гражданины, чтобы
The second point is a very important one.
прежнее российское руководство
I want you, as an American citizen, and your viewers to hear about this as well.
больше никаких разделителей.
The former Russian leadership assumed that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and therefore there were no longer any ideological dividing lines.
Инициативно пошла даже на развал Советского Союза.
Russia even agreed voluntarily and proactively to the collapse of the Soviet Union
Называемым
and believed that this would be understood by the so-called civilized West as an invitation for cooperation and
вот чего
association.
ожидала Россия.
That is what Russia was expecting, both from the United States and the so-called collective West as a whole.
В том числе и в Германии. Эгон Барр.
There were smart people, including in Germany, Egon Bahr, a major politician of the Social Democratic Party, who insisted in his personal conversations with the Soviet leadership on the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union that a new security system should be established in Europe.
Помочь объединиться Германии, но
Help should be given to unify Germany, but a new system should be also established to include the United States, Canada, Russia, and other Central European countries.
Yes.
But NATO needs not to expand. That's what he said. If NATO expands, everything would be just the same as during the Cold War, only closer to Russia's borders. That's all.
Больше того, он рассердился как-то.
He was a wise old man, but no one listened to him. In fact, he got angry once.
Рассердился на советское руководство.
If, he said, you don't listen to me, I'm never setting my foot in Moscow once again.
Но, tем не менее,
Everything happened just as he had said.
Well, of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that the opposite happened. But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of.
That's a very puzzling comment that Vladimir Putin is going to contradict very clearly in a moment. Tucker Carlson claiming that the West doesn't fear China. Actually, as President Putin is going to say, the West fears China most and therefore is tackling Russia as part of the strategy to tackle China.
What about Russia, do you think, convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia. Because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion population, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds, or 5% a year. It used to be even more. But
yes, they've reduced economic growth in China, and of course the growth is driven by a decentralized banking system. And if you ensure that bank credit is used for productive business investment, mainly for small firms, you get high growth. China's been doing that, although the leadership has taken down the growth rate. Something that has been done, of course, in many other countries, in Japan, in Germany also, as they reduce the number of banks there. But yes, Russia could have much higher growth. That's something where perhaps, the right advice is still needed.
enough for China. As Bismarck once put it, potentials are the most important. China's potential is enormous. It is the biggest economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy. It has already overtaken the United States quite a long time ago, and it is growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom. Let's not reason in such terms. And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there's no communist party power. Let's negotiate. Moreover, I have also said this publicly before.
Был момент, когда
There was a moment when
серая кошка пробежала.
a certain rift started growing between us. Before that, Yeltsin came to the United States. Remember, he spoke in Congress and said the good words. God bless America. Everything he said were signals. Let us in. Remember the developments in Yugoslavia before the Yeltsin was lavished with praise? As soon as the developments in Yugoslavia started, he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but raise our voices for Serbs in their defense. I understand that there were complex processes underway there, I do, but Russia could not help raising its voice in support of Serbs because...
So really, to answer Tucker Carlson's question, why did this rift happen once the Soviet Union fell? Putin here points out that really it started when, well, number one, NATO expanded eastwards, but number two, NATO turned from a defense alliance to an attack alliance that actually actively attacked a country, and it bombed Serbia, which is something that at the time also many people in Europe, in Western Europe, were shocked by. But this was a US-led campaign. The British were also part of that argument, and they, so NATO had a concerted bombing of Serbia. And because Serbia is Eastern Orthodox by religion, but also the Serb people and the Russian people feel quite close, maybe not quite as close as the Russians feel to Ukrainians, but maybe that's the second, after that, the next level, also quite close to Serbs. The Russians spoke up and said, what are you doing? You shouldn't be, NATO shouldn't be bombing Serbia. But then, of course, Russia was also criticized. Why are you defending Serbia?
Serbs are also a special and close to us nation, with Orthodox culture and so on. It's a nation that has suffered so much for generations. Well, regardless, what is important is that Yeltsin expressed his support. What did the United States do? In violation of an international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. It was the United States that let the genie out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia protested and expressed its resentment, what was said? The UN Charter and international law have become obsolete. Now everyone invokes international law, but at that time they started saying that everything was outdated. Everything had to be changed. Indeed, some things need to be changed, as the balance of power has changed. It's true, but
there were some very aggressive signals being given by the Americans as this bombing happened, because the Americans also bombed in Serbia, in the capital city, the Chinese embassy, things like that. So it was really sowing the seeds for what has now emerged more strongly, namely some kind of antagonism between the US and Russia on the one hand and China on the other hand.
in this manner. Yeltsin was immediately dragged through the mud, accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing, of knowing nothing. He understood everything, I assure you. Well, I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, the Yugoslav issue is over, but we should try to restore relations. Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through. And moreover, I said it publicly, I can
в
reiterate.
Кремле с уходящим от власти Биллом
At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him,
Если бы Россия поставила вопрос о вступлении в НАТО,
Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen?
он сказал, ты знаешь, это интересно.
Suddenly he said, you know, it's interesting. I think so.
Встретились. Уже на
But
ужин.
in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, you know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now.
Можете спросить у него. Да, я думаю, наши...
You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview.
Я
He'll
никогда не
confirm it.
столчу подобного
I
говорить,
wouldn't
если
have said anything like that if it hadn't happened.
невозможно.
So here, Vladimir Putin is telling us presidents don't make such strategic decisions. And it's not because they're going back to Congress to get a political endorsement. No. So who is calling the shots when President Clinton asks his team? Well, there is the so-called secret team. In fact, that's the title of a book, The Secret Team, written by Fletcher Prouty. You can get it on Amazon. For decades, you could not get it in any bookshop, but it tells you who is calling the shots and who is deciding foreign policy. It's written by the former head of chief of covert operations, special operations at the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House, Fletcher Prouty. So, have a good read of that. Then you hear about the secret team. So when Clinton speaks to his team, he will hear what is possible and what is not. And so they told him, nope, we won't allow Russia in.
Okay.
Were you
well,
sincere?
It's impossible now.
Because of course the military-industrial complex needs an enemy, and Russia at that time, they figured, or have already since that time, figured they want as an enemy. And of course for the Russians this was a big shock. It's quite genuine. When I was in Russia, and I've been there many times, it's very clear Russians like Western Europe. They in many ways look up to Western Europe, and they want to be part of it, and they feel like, hey, you guys are treating us not nicely. You're treating us like some kind of country bumpkin, and you don't let us in. You don't take us seriously as Europeans, and that's a result of these, being rebuffed many times by NATO. So basically, since '91, this has become very, very strong.
Would you have joined NATO?
Послушайте,
Look, I asked the question, is it possible or not? And the answer I got was no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out what the leadership position was,
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
если бы он...
if he had said yes, the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and eventually it might have happened if we had seen some sincere wish on the
It's noteworthy here that he gives very correct answers. He could have simplified by saying, yes, we would have joined. Who is to disprove it because it's a counterfactual, right? But here, I think it shows his sincerity and his honesty. He's saying, well, actually, don't jump the gun. There's a process. If you want to give a proper answer, then the proper answer is, yes, if you say yes, then we start the process. There's negotiations. We have to go through the details. These are serious matters. Matters of state, it takes a time, but if the will is there, then yes, it will happen. But the process is there. So he didn't want to simplify. And I noticed this several times during this interview, where he could have given simple, basically sound bites for the camera, but instead he gave an intellectually honest, clearly therefore more detailed and more careful answer. Because he doesn't want to speak in sound bites, but that just makes him very sincere. He is, I think he believes what he's saying.
side of our partners. But it didn't happen. Well, no means no. Okay, fine.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive, I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
Вы сказали, что
You said I was bitter about the answer. No, it's not bitterness. It's just a statement of fact. We're not bride and groom, bitterness, resentment. It's not about those kind of matters in such circumstances. We just realized we weren't welcome there, that's all. Okay, fine. But let's build relations in another manner. Let's look for common ground elsewhere. Why we received such a negative response, you should ask your leaders. I can only guess why. Too big a country with its own opinion and so on. And the United States, I've seen how issues are being resolved in NATO.
Ну, я же видел, как решают.
I will give you another example now concerning Ukraine.
How the United States resolves issues? Well, by bullying other countries that are part of the alliance, NATO. And of course, Russia would be hard to bully.
Примеры сейчас приведу, касающиеся
The US leadership exerts pressure, and all NATO members obediently vote,
голосуют. Даже если им
even if they do not like something.
Я скажу в этой связи, что происходило с Украиной.
Now, I'll tell you what happened in this regard with Ukraine in 2008, although it's being discussed. I'm not going to open a secret to you, say anything new.
По-разному выстроить отношения.
Nevertheless, after that, we tried to build relations in different ways.
События.
For example, the events in the Middle East, in Iraq.
Мы
We were building relations with the United States in a very soft, prudent, cautious manner. I repeatedly raised the issue that the United States should not support separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus.
Северном Кавказе. Но все равно продолжали это делать.
But they continued to do it anyway. And political support, information support, financial support, even military support came from the United States and its satellites for terrorist groups in the Caucasus. I once raised this issue with my colleague, also the President of the United States. He says, "It's impossible. Do you have proof?" I said, "Yes." I was prepared for this conversation, and I gave him that proof. He looked at it, and you know what he said? I apologize, but that's what happened. I'll quote. He says, "Well, I'm gonna kick their ass." We waited and waited for some response. There was no reply.
The last US president to kick ass of the CIA with all its, covert operations, special operations, regime change, assassinations, essentially, being an illegal operation engaged in criminal activities across the board. The last president to challenge that was John F. Kennedy, and as is now increasingly being admitted, even on a Tucker Carlson interview, that was still when he was at Fox News, if I remember correctly, it was the CIA who most likely killed JFK because he had stopped the CIA on a number of key occasions and was about to disband the CIA because it was out of control, destroy it, smash it to 1,000 pieces, scatter it in the wind, he said all these things. And secondly, of course, he had challenged the Federal Reserve, central banking power, the privately owned Federal Reserve banks. He challenged all that by issuing United States notes, identical to Federal Reserve notes, but without the Federal Reserve seal and headed United States notes. He did those two things in 1963, which was the last year of his life. So presidents after that have not tackled the secret team. And Clinton, another case in point, showing that he had to do what he was told by the CIA.
I said to the FSB director, "Write to the CIA, what is the result of the conversation with President?" He wrote once, twice, and then we got a reply. We have the answer in the archive. The CIA replied, "We have been working with the opposition in Russia. We believe that this is the right thing to do, and we will keep on doing it."
It's interesting, isn't it? So it just shows the sincerity of the Russians. He's asking his head of the Secret Service, the successor to the KGB, KGB, FSB, write to the CIA. I want to hear what the result is. And the CIA responds in the end, no, well, we're doing it and we'll continue to do it. Okay. So, of course, that meant the Americans, the CIA, continues to choose to be antagonistic, supporting terrorists inside Russia, the Caucasus area, Chechnya. And of course, the Russians can't allow that. But that explains why they're quite defensive, and clearly when you then have Ukraine wanting to join that same military alliance directly, formally, then you can expect all sorts of activities, further activities by the CIA.
The CIA is trying to overthrow your government.
Ну, конечно, имелось в виду в данном случае.
Of course, they meant in that particular case the separatists, the terrorists who fought with us in the Caucasus.
Они их называли.
That's who they called the opposition.
Это вот второй момент.
This is the
Третий
second
момент очень
point.
важный.
Of course, that's the same argument that was made later in Syria, where both the British Secret Service and the American Secret Services and military services have been supporting the opposition. Now, we say opposition, but this is not a peaceful political opposition. We're not talking about parties. We're talking about who they euphemistically called the moderate rebels, when actually they were so moderate they would kill people, cut their hearts out, eat their hearts. I mean, they were nasty terrorists, and they, Al Qaeda and ISIS and all that stuff, funded, supported, weapons supplied by the US and the UK against the Syrian government to overthrow this government. Again, it was Russia that stepped in and prevented the worst from happening, but tens of thousands, if not more, Christians were persecuted, killed, and the Christian ancient villages destroyed. The village where they still speak the ancient Aramaic that Jesus spoke, destroyed by these moderate rebels who kill and rape and devastate the place, drive people out, funded by the US and the UK.
The third moment is a very important one. Is the moment when the US missile defense system was created.
Начало.
The beginning.
И мы долго уговаривали.
We persuaded for a long time not to do it in the United States.
Меня пригласили в
Moreover,
отец Буша
after was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean,
Там состоялась очень серьезная беседа,
I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team.
чтобы
I proposed that the United States, Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that we believe,
которая, как мы считаем,
if created unilaterally, threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was being created against missile threats from Iran. That was the justification for the deployment of the missile defense system. I suggested working together, Russia, the United States, and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I said, "Absolutely."
Let me ask, what year was this?
Ну, я не помню. Вот,
I don't remember.
в интернете, когда я был.
It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of Bush Sr. It is even easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about.
Мне сказали, это очень интересно.
I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together. The world will change. We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, "Are you serious?" I said, "Of course. We need to think about it," I'm told.
Вот в этот кабинет.
I said, "Go ahead, please." Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came in here in this cabinet, right here at this table, they sat on this table. Me, the foreign minister, the Russian defense minister on that side.
Министр обороны.
They said to me, yes, we have thought about it. We agree. I said, thank God, great,
No.
but with some exceptions.
So twice you've described US presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who were elected in your telling.
Именно так.
That's right,
Конечно,
that's
не
right.
итоге нас послали подальше. Я не буду...
In the end, they just told us to get lost. I'm not going to tell you the details because I think it's incorrect. After all, it was confidential
Наше предложение
conversation.
было...
Again, the Russians, in my experience, are very correct, and they always stick to the rules. So, I mean, he could have easily given some more details, some juicy bits. Lots of lies are being told to denigrate President Putin and criticize him in the West and give him a bad reputation. He could easily use some of the secrets that he has about Western leaders. But no, he doesn't do that. It's incorrect. He sticks to the rules of diplomacy, and that's what the Russians have always done. I mean, it's the same with the gas deliveries to Western Europe, to Germany. They've done that throughout the Cold War. They were reliable, and they continued right until the end. It was the U.S. government destroying the pipeline, as we'll hear, and the German government shutting down purchases from Russia, not Russia, because there were agreements, and they would stick to these agreements and deliver reliably.
But our proposal was declined. That's a
Да,
fact.
именно тогда. Я сказал,
It was right then when I said, look, but then we will be forced to take countermeasures.
будем создавать такие...
We will
Да.
create such strike systems that will certainly overcome missile defense
Ответ
systems.
был такой.
The answer was, we are not doing this against you, and you do what you want, assuming that it is not against us, not against the United States.
Гиперзвуковые системы.
I said, okay, very well. That's the way it went. And we
These are very important points for the world to hear. So Russia wanted to join NATO and was rebuffed. Russia wanted to proposed a joint development of a missile defense system and was rebuffed. And as a result was forced, and this is accepted by and encouraged by the Americans, to develop its own missile system, and of course has now the most advanced system.
created hypersonic systems with intercontinental range, and we continue to develop them. We are now ahead of everyone, the United States and the other countries, in terms of the development of hypersonic strike systems, and we are improving them every day. But it wasn't us. We proposed to go the other way, and we were pushed back.
По поводу расширения НАТО на восток.
Now, about NATO's expansion to the
Какого
east.
НАТО на восток?
Well, we were promised no NATO to the east, not an inch to the east, as we were told. And then what?
Ну,
They said, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we'll expand.
5 расширений.
So there were 5 waves of expansion. The Baltic states,
So Russia was tricked because, and the West argued, the US argued, UK, NATO argued that, we didn't have a proper treaty where we committed to not pushing, NATO further east. We just said it orally in several meetings. There are minutes, there are records. The Russians accepted that, and turns out they were too naive. I mean, it's similar to the German leadership before the First World War, and so it's good for the world to hear this.
all of Eastern Europe, and so on.
И вот теперь прихожу к главному.
And now I come to the main thing. They have come to the Ukraine, ultimately. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they declared that the doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO were open. Now about how decisions are made there.
So that is the red line, and of course the West, NATO, the US know very well. That was a red line. The Russian leadership had said that many times, that Ukraine cannot join NATO. Ukraine is a big country, and has a long border with Russia. It's right next to Russia. And on top of that, of course, there are also millions of ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. And if you make that even more a sort of, separate entity that is now part of quite a clearly antagonistic military alliance led by the US, that was a step too far. It would be both a military security risk, but also I think it would have been politically totally unacceptable for the Russian leadership. President Putin is very popular in Russia. There's absolutely no doubt. The majority, really like him. They adore him. But if he had said, "Oh, NATO can be, can come to Ukraine. Ukraine can be NATO country and be therefore formally against us, antagonistic, and a security risk," that would not have been popular in Russia. And Russians would never understand that. And why it's not necessary. They can just be neutral. We've given them independence. We've made them independent. It was Russia that made Ukraine independent. They get all our territories here. Crimea was given by Khrushchev to Ukraine, and the other ethnic Russian, areas. But just don't join NATO, okay? Don't turn against us. That was a step too far. And of course, if you look at the US, would the US ever allow Mexico to have a strong and close military alliance with China and station weapons there and so on against the US? No, they wouldn't. And we know this, of course, because even Cuba, which is a bit further away, the US said that's our red line. And, they were prepared, and they made this clear, to go to war over this. Well, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? When they were going to station Soviet missiles on Cuba, and the US said, no, that's our red line. Well, how can you then expect Russia, successor of the Soviet Union, to allow Ukraine, which they always feel is part of Russia, as the historical part, shows, or the origin of Russia, if you want. How can they allow that to become a place where you station, weapons pointed at Russia? It's a red line, and the US would say the same thing in this situation.
France seemed to be against it, as well as some other European countries. But then, as it turned out, later, President Bush, and he's such a tough guy, a tough politician, as I was told later, he exerted pressure on us, and we had to agree. It's ridiculous. It's like kindergarten. Where are the guarantees? What kindergarten is this? What kind of people are these? Who are they? You see, they were pressed, they agreed. And then they say, Ukraine won't be in the NATO, I say, I don't know. I know you agreed in 2008. Why won't you agree in the future? Well, they pressed us then. I say, why won't they press you tomorrow? And you'll agree again. Well, it's nonsensical. Who's there to talk to? I just don't understand. We're ready to talk. But with whom? Where are the guarantees? None. So they started to develop the territory of Ukraine. Whatever is there, I have told you the background, how this territory developed, what kind of relations there were with Russia. Every second or third person there has always had some ties with Russia. And during the elections in already independent, sovereign Ukraine, which gained its independence as a result of the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, it says that Ukraine is a neutral state, and in 2008, suddenly the doors or gates to NATO were open to it. Oh, come on. This is not how we agreed.
I myself met, in Russia, ethnic Ukrainians, and of course they said that, we speak Russian, they intermarry, and they were, quite a few in this increasing tension between Ukraine after 2014 and Russia. in this increasing tension. There were, many chose to move to Russia and be more on the Russian side. Even those with very typical Ukrainian surnames, So, that's also my experience. They're very close. And he's saying that every second or third person has ties to Russia. I think that is true. Of course, if you exclude particularly the very western part of Ukraine, which used to be Poland, that's maybe a different story. But for the rest...
Now, all the presidents that have come to power in Ukraine, they relied on electorate with a good attitude to Russia in one way or the other. This is the southeast of Ukraine. This is a large number of people. And it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate, which had a positive attitude towards Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power, and how? The first time he won after President Kuchma, they organized a third round, which is not provided for in the constitution of Ukraine. This is a coup d'etat. Just imagine someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome.
In 2014?
Before that. No, this was before that. After President Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych won the elections. However, his opponents did not recognize that victory. The US supported the opposition, and the third round was scheduled. What is this? This is a coup. The US supported it, and the winner of the third round came to power. Imagine if in the US something was not to someone's liking, and the third round of election, which the US Constitution does not provide for, was organized. Nonetheless, it was done in Ukraine. Okay, Viktor Yushchenko, who was considered a pro-Western politician, came to power. Fine, we have built relations with him as well. He came to Moscow with visits. We visited Kiev. I visited too. We met in an informal setting. If he's pro-Western, so be it. It's fine. Let people do their job. The situation should have developed inside the independent Ukraine itself. As a result of Kuchma's leadership, things got worse, and Viktor Yanukovych came to power after all. Maybe he wasn't the best president and politician. I don't know. I don't want to give assessments. However, the issue of the association with the EU came up. We have always been lenient to this. Suit yourself. But when we read through the Treaty of Association, it turned out to be a problem for us, since we had a free trade zone and open customs borders with Ukraine, which under this association had to open its borders for Europe, which would have led to flooding of our market. We said, no, this is not going to work. We shall close our borders with Ukraine then. The customs borders, that is. Yanukovych started to calculate how much Ukraine was going to gain, how much to lose, and said to his European partners, I need more time to think before signing. The moment he said that, the opposition began to take destructive steps, which were supported by the West. It all came down to Maidan and a coup in Ukraine.
So he did more trade with Russia than with the EU. Ukraine did.
Of course. It's not even the matter of trade volume, although for the most part it is. It is the matter of cooperation ties, which the entire Ukrainian economy was based on. The cooperation ties between the enterprises were very close since the times of the Soviet Union. One enterprise there used to produce components to be assembled both in Russia and Ukraine, and vice versa. They used to be very close ties. A coup d'etat was committed, although I shall not delve into details now, as I find doing it inappropriate, the US told us. Calm Yanukovych down, and we will calm the opposition. Let the situation unfold in the scenario of a political settlement. We said, all right, agreed, let's do it this way. As the Americans requested, Yanukovych did use neither the armed forces nor the police, yet the armed opposition committed a coup in Kiev. What is that supposed to mean? Who do you think you are? I wanted to ask the then US leadership.
With the backing of whom?
So what we learn here is that, we see that Putin, Russia was tricked once again by the West, by America. The Russians were naively, just genuinely cooperating with the US. And the idea was, okay, let's all step back and let's, America was, really closer to the opposition. You keep them calm, you keep the president calm, okay, fine. But then, and he told the president of Ukraine, step back and don't use military and so on, don't use the police. And he did all that. But then a coup d'etat was staged. And by who? Tucker Carlson is asking.
При поддержке ЦРУ, конечно.
With the backing of CIA, of course. The organization you wanted to join back in the day, as I understand.
So, a little dig here. And also showing that, of course, he knows a bit more than he's letting on. He knows that Tucker Carlson wanted to join the CIA.
We should thank God they didn't let you in. Although, it is a serious organization. I understand. My former vis-a-vis in the sense that I served in the first main directorate, Soviet Union's intelligence service. They have always been our opponents. A job is a job.
Но технически они все сделали правильно.
Technically, they did everything right. They achieved their goal of changing the government. However, from political standpoint, it was a colossal mistake.
So, in 2014, the CIA staged a regime change coup d'etat. The democratically elected president Yanukovych was driven out of office, and then essentially an undemocratic coup d'etat government was imposed with the help of the CIA. And we know, of course, this has been long known. They spent $5 billion on this. The demonstrators, were actually literally paid. I mean, this is something that's been happening in Germany and other places where demonstrators are hired. They get a salary. Various organizations, including Soros', organizations, fund them, pay them, hire them. This is part of the regime change process that the CIA has run in many, many countries. And they did this in 2014 in Ukraine, just because the president Yanukovych, who was not originally very pro-Russian, but he just, he wanted more time to calculate, well, hang on, okay, if we join the EU, then we can't at the same time be in an open, free trade area with Russia. Therefore, which one is better? I need more time. That was enough for the CIA to say, okay, we're going to kick him out and we're going to establish somebody who will be more directly doing what we say. And of course, the famous video, the famous recording of the telephone conversation of Victoria Nuland at the time, Undersecretary of State, talking to the US ambassador in Ukraine about who we're going to have as, prime minister, as president, who we're going to have for this and that position, and clearly being in charge. So there's no doubt. Good quality recording, clearly leaked by the Russians. They rarely do this, it seems. I mean, they could have leaked quite a lot more stuff since, but it was strategically quite important for the West to be aware of that, for the population in the West to be aware of that.
Surely it was political leadership's miscalculation. They should have seen what it would evolve into.
But that's the trouble, because the CIA has all the resources, unlimited essentially. A lot of the 20 trillion US dollars that are missing, is because of these black ops, off budget CIA covert operations. On 9/10, the day before 9/11, famously, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld gave a speech saying, "There is an enemy right here." He gave the speech in the Pentagon. "There is an enemy right here in the Pentagon." The enemy is that the audit office is accusing us we've lost 10 trillion. Where is it? Well, the next day, the audit office people were dead because of a missile shot into the Pentagon. I mean, they say that it was a plane by hijackers, but clearly there's no evidence of that. No single part of a plane or engine or anything was ever found, and so on. But anyway, so yeah, these black ops and these huge budgets are indicative of the CIA having, top information. They're spending a lot of resources on this, and then you get some politician who, is supposed to stay in charge of all this, but they don't have the resources, and they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the know-how. So President Putin points out here that the political leadership should have known that if they let the Secret Service do this, it will lead to disaster. But of course, they don't have the knowledge. And that's even assuming they have the power, which, as we saw earlier, the example of President Clinton, they don't.
So in 2008, the doors of NATO were open for Ukraine. In 2014, there was a coup. They started persecuting those who did not accept the coup, and it was indeed a coup. They created a threat to Crimea, which we had to take under our protection.
Of course, on the Crimea, which is, historically been Russian, they did a referendum, and the majority, 90-something%, wanted to join Russia. But of course, it was already the location in 2014 when this happened of the Black Sea. The Russian Black Sea Navy located on the Crimea Peninsula. And of course, if the Crimea Peninsula was going to be very anti-Russian, then it would be a problem for the military bases there. So that was always likely to happen. And they could easily take it because the troops were already there. The Russian troops were stationed on the Crimea Peninsula. That was basically impossible for Ukraine to keep.
They launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with the use of aircraft and artillery against civilians.
That's another very important point. That, those who follow media and try to make sure they get independent information have been well aware of this for the last, 9 years. That since 2014, when this coup d'etat was put in place and therefore an illegitimate government was now running Ukraine, this illegitimate but CIA staged government was turning very anti-Russian, not just internationally, with the neighbor, but also inside the country against its own people, and would literally start to bomb its own population in East Ukraine, the Donbas area, because they refused to implement what they were told suddenly, namely to stop speaking Russian and use the Russian way of spelling things and so on, and any type of autonomy was taken away, and they refused to do this. Then there were threats, and then they started to literally bomb the place, and of course that's where 9 years of civil war essentially commenced, which President Putin had said before the February 22 special military operation, he would have to intervene if the US doesn't finally stop this and tell the Kiev regime to stop bombing its own people, the Ukrainians, passport holders of Ukraine passport who are ethnically Russian and identify fully with Russia. If the war against them doesn't stop, then Russia would have to step in to defend them and to appease and essentially pacify the region, which is what led to the February 2022 military operation.
This is when it all started. There's a video of aircraft attacking Donetsk from above. They launched a large-scale military operation, then another one. When they failed, they started to prepare the next one. All this against the background of military development of this territory and opening of NATO's doors. How could we not express concern over what was happening? From our side, this would have been a culpable negligence. That's what it would have been. It's just that the US political leadership pushed us to the line we could not cross, because doing so could have ruined Russia itself. Besides, we could not leave our brothers in faith, in fact, a part of Russian people, in the face of this war machine.
But that was 8 years before the current conflict started. So what was the trigger for you? What was the moment where you decided you had to do this?
Спровоцировал конфликт изначально.
Initially, it was the coup in Ukraine that provoked the conflict. By the way, back then the representatives of 3 European countries.
So here, importantly, President Putin is saying the conflict didn't start in February 22. You see, Tucker Carlson's question is from a US viewpoint. The conflict starts in February 22. And of course, President Putin's response is no, the conflict started with the coup d'etat. They immediately then took military action against their own people, and it's been going on ever since. And that's when Russia increasingly felt they had to help.
Germany, Poland, and France arrived. They were the guarantors of the signed agreement between the government of Yanukovych and the opposition. They signed it as guarantors. Despite that, the opposition committed a coup, and all these countries pretended that they didn't remember that they were guarantors of the peaceful settlement.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So it wasn't just, as President Putin had explained orally, this agreement that everyone makes sure everyone stays calm. They actually had this in writing, and these countries European countries were guarantors. They were going to guarantee that, which meant that really they should have stepped in with the coup d'etat, but they didn't. Oh, they tricked Russia.
They just threw it in the stove right away, and nobody recalls that. I don't know if the US know anything about the agreement between the opposition and the authorities, and its 3 guarantors who, instead of bringing this whole situation back in the political field, supported the coup. Although it was meaningless, believe me, because President Yanukovych agreed to all conditions. He was ready to hold an early election, which he had no chance of winning, frankly speaking. Everyone knew that. Then why the coup? Why the victims? Why threatening Crimea? Why launching an operation in Donbass? This I do not understand. That is exactly what the miscalculation is. CIA did its job to complete the coup. I think one of the deputy secretaries of state said that it cost a large sum of money, almost 5 billion. But the political mistake was colossal. Why would they have to do that? All this could have been done legally, without victims, without military action, without losing Crimea. We would have never considered to even lift a finger if it hadn't been for the bloody developments on Maidan. Because we agreed with the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our borders should be along the borders of former Union's republics. We agreed to that. But we never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us. For decades, we kept asking, don't do this, don't do that. And what triggered the latest events? Firstly, the current Ukrainian leadership declared that it would not implement the Minsk agreements, which had been signed, as you know, after the events of 2014 in Minsk, where the plan of peaceful settlement in Donbass was set forth.
Нет, руководство
But no, the current Ukrainian leadership, foreign minister, all other officials, and then president himself said that they don't like anything about the Minsk agreements.
иными словами, исполнять не собираются.
In other words, they were not going to implement it.
Прямо сказали, что подписывали уже
A year and a half ago, former leaders of Germany and France said openly to the whole world
это соглашение Минска.
that they indeed signed the Minsk agreements, but they never intended to implement them.
This is true. I mean, I know this statement by the former chancellor in Germany, Merkel, where she made clear that they sort of half felt proud. You know, we tricked Russia into believing there will be, you know, peaceful process. Everyone will stick to this Minsk agreement, which would give some autonomy to the eastern Ukraine, Donbass region, and so on, and there will be peace. And that was, 8 years earlier, but actually there was no peace, and they would always delay. And in the end, they came out and saying, no, we've signed this, but actually we don't care about it. We're not going to honor it. And Germany, France, again, we're happy with that because, as Chancellor Merkel said, it was actually done in order to win time and rearm Ukraine. I mean, that is pretty outrageous. That is highly dishonest and, of course, very aggressive stance against Russia, because it's all about, let's have war. And this is, of course, really the gist of really what President Putin is saying in this interview, that this war was started by the West. And that also explains why whenever there's a mainstream media news item beginning on the military operation in Ukraine, they always say, the unprovoked full-scale war launched by Russia against Ukraine. Well, it's just not true. It's clearly not unprovoked. It was massively provoked again and again, and Russia has been super patient for 8 years. And so it's not just not unprovoked, but also they call it a full-scale invasion. It's not a full-scale invasion. It's just the Russian areas that at the time actually formally also asked Russia for help. A full-blown invasion looks very different. The fact that there were Russian troops around Kiev is another story. Russia actually withdrew them when there were very successful peace negotiations already, a few months, I think just a month after the special operation started, and that was always the point. They thought Ukraine would come to their senses and see that clearly it's complete waste of lives to have a military conflict over this. Let's settle this peacefully. And of course, that would have revived a lot of the Minsk already signed agreement clauses. But again, suddenly a Britisher turns up and scuppers the peace, as we'll see.
Led us by the nose.
Was there anyone for you to talk to? Did you call a U.S. President, Secretary of State, and say, if you keep militarizing Ukraine with NATO forces, this is going to be
That's a silly question, because President Putin has been warning non-stop, not just in Russia, but also outside through his foreign minister Lavrov, and spokesman and statements and UN, essentially tabling it at the UN. So it's been brought up by Russia again and again and again. And Tucker Carlson asks, "Oh, have you ever mentioned this before?" Yes.
act?
Мы постоянно об этом говорим. Мы обращались
We talked about this all the time. We addressed the United States and European countries' leadership to stop these developments immediately, to implement the Minsk agreements. Frankly speaking, I didn't know how we were going to do this, but I was ready to implement them. These agreements were complicated for Ukraine. They included lots of elements of those Donbass territories' independence. That's true. However, I was absolutely confident, and I'm saying this to you now. I honestly believe that if we managed to convince the residents of Donbass, and we had to work hard to convince them to return to the Ukrainian statehood, then gradually the wounds would start to heal. When this part of territory reintegrated itself into common social environment, when the pensions and social benefits were paid again, all the pieces would gradually fall into place. No, nobody wanted that. Everybody wanted to resolve the issue by military force only. But we could not let that happen. And the situation got to the point when the Ukrainian side announced, no, we will not do anything. They also started preparing for military action. It was they who started the war in 2014. Our goal is to stop this war. And we did not start this war in 2022. This is an attempt to stop it.
Do you think you've stopped it now? I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification. This means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. This is one of the problems that we discussed during the negotiation process, which ended in Istanbul early this year. And it was not our initiative, because we were told by the Europeans, in particular, that it was necessary to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My counterparts in France and Germany said, how can you imagine them signing a treaty with a gun to their heads? The troops should be pulled back from Kiev. I said, all right. We withdrew the troops from Kiev. As soon as we pulled back our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin and got prepared for a long-standing armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe.
Yes, and of course, that's when the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson turned up and essentially wanted to prevent this peace treaty from being signed.
That is how the situation has developed, and that is how it looks now.
But what is, pardon my ignorance, what is denazification? What would that mean? What is...
Да, вот я как раз хочу сейчас об этом сказать. Это очень важный вопрос. Денацификация.
That is what I want to talk about right now. It is a very important issue. Denazification. After gaining independence, Ukraine began to search, as some Western analysts say, its identity. And it came up with nothing better than to build this identity upon some false heroes who collaborated with Hitler.
Actually, the other point is when Russia withdrew troops around Kiev, that was celebrated by the Western media as a victory. Oh, we've won, and Russia had a bad defeat, and for months they would write about this, how the Ukrainian troops and so on have been so successful. It's just all lies. They tricked Russia into believing, okay, we have a peace agreement, and so yes, you can already take those troops back because we're about to sign. And then as soon as the troops were gone, oh, we're not signing. In fact, there were many Ukrainians that really wanted that peace deal. So it's very clear there was severe foreign interference to prevent that peace treaty. One of the Ukrainian peace negotiators who were on the official Ukrainian delegation on the desk negotiating was shot by Ukrainian forces. And it seems that he was one of those staunch peacemakers who wanted peace, and he was shot. Of course, we know the CIA is in charge of this, and they've been running assassinations. as soon as they were created, basically in 1947. So that's the sad reality.